Podem tomar os vossos lugares calmamente. Não deixe de sublinhar como é vibrante e entusiasmante e surpreendente, de uma certa forma até, sentir a alegria. Estava a partilhar isso agora com a nossa próxima convidada, a alegria que se sente perante um encontro destes. Coisas tão bizarras, longínquas, estranhas e misteriosas e algumas delas indecifráveis, pelo menos num primeiro momento, mas tão fascinantes e tão importantes. A próxima conversa vai demonstrar-nos como é falsa aquela ideia de que the sky is the limit. Não é? O céu, não, nem o céu é o limite. E será, é certo que é a segunda sessão de hoje, mas será a antecâmara depois da sessão final, em que iremos questionar se haverá sequer limites. Carl Sagan, o primeiro dos grandes divulgadores de ciência dos tempos modernos, dizia que não somos mais do que poeira de estrelas. Entre as muitas coisas que fez, ele escreveu um romance que foi adaptado para cinema pelo Robert Zemeckis, em que ele próprio e a mulher redigiram o guião desse filme. O filme tinha o mesmo nome do livro, era O Contacto. A atriz principal era a Jodie Foster. E nesse filme, a personagem interpretada pela Jodie Foster dizia a determinada altura, a explicar a um grupo de crianças o que era o universo. E ela dizia, numa tradução mais ou menos livre, é um local muito grande, maior do que tudo o que alguém possa sequer imaginar. E se nós formos o único planeta com vida, parece apenas um terrível desperdício de espaço. A próxima convidada pensa exatamente assim. Aliás, entre as suas múltiplas tarefas, ela foi também consultora especial da equipa de realização deste filme, do Contacto, dos anos 90, se não estou enganado. E se alguém está em condições de estabelecer contacto com formas de vida extraterrestres, essa pessoa é ela. Ela é especialista em analisar e interpretar as imagens captadas pelas câmaras, pelos telescópios, pelas câmaras das sondas, pelas câmaras espaciais que registam as imagens do universo e transmitem de volta para a Terra. Liderou, por exemplo, e de resto com grande sucesso, a equipa de imagiologistas da sonda Cassini, da missão Cassini, que é responsável por ter fixado o conhecimento, uma grande parte do conhecimento que nós temos hoje em dia da nossa galáxia e daquilo que os instrumentos que o ser humano conseguiu enviar para o espaço captaram e trouxeram de volta. Era preciso interpretá-los, perceber o que significavam aquelas imagens. Quem fez foi a equipa liderada pela Carolyn Porco, que é a próxima convidada. E esta sessão vai sublinhar, penso eu, aquilo que vimos no filme da apresentação. O efeito de acrescentar um zero até chegarmos, neste caso, ao infinitamente grande. É uma viagem mesmo até ao infinitamente grande. A sessão vai ser conduzida por uma cientista portuguesa que se apresenta com uma profissão muito pouco comum. Para mim, ela é a única pessoa no mundo que tem esta profissão. É astrobióloga, é a Zita Martins. Zita, Carolyn, please welcome.
Obrigada.
Take your seat. Carolyn, welcome. Uma astrobióloga, como o nome indica, é alguém que procura, digo eu de uma forma muito simples, Zita, sinais de vida nos astros, não é? Ou nos fragmentos que chegam ao alcance do ser humano para poder analisar e interpretar. A professora Zita Martins já trabalhou na NASA, na Agência Espacial Europeia. É professora associada do Instituto Superior Técnico, no Departamento de Química e Física Molecular, depois de passagens por várias universidades europeias. Que a viagem comece.
Obrigada. Boa tarde a todos, bem-vindos. É para mim um grande prazer estar aqui e é também com borboletas no estômago poder estar aqui sentada. And I'm going to switch to English, obviously. And I'll start by by the name of the session. So infinitely small, infinitely big. So we're going to be talking, and this is all about origin of life from very small organic molecules to the very far away planets that may host life. I'm an astrobiologist, as it was mentioned now, and these were the topics that made me fall madly in love for this research field. And this was only possible because of exceptional scientists all over the world. And Carolyn Porco is obviously included in this list of scientists. Her work as planetary scientist concerns the exploration of the outer solar system, including the Voyager space missions to Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune, and obviously the Cassini-Huygens mission to Saturn and his system. She's an expert on one of my favorite moons, Enceladus, because it's a moon that may host life. She has given many public talks, including 2 TED Talks, and she was awarded the National Geographic inaugural Eliza Skidmore Award for Outstanding Science Media. She's been named one of the 25 most influential people in space by Time magazine, and I have to say, for me, she's one of the coolest people in the world, because she was the advisor on the film Star Trek, and she was also the advisor in my personal favorite movie, and the reason why I'm an astrobiologist, Contact.
Yes.
Bringing science fiction to reality, this session will take us on a beautiful journey throughout the wonders of the solar system. Please welcome Carolyn Porco.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Zita, for that lovely introduction. Thank you to the Foundation and to Portugal for inviting me to speak at this special 10th anniversary celebration. And thank you all for being here. I'm going to speak to you today, as you heard, about searching for life in the solar system. Now, scientists haven't yet settled on what is the best way to do that, but I'm going to make an effort to try to describe to you where we are at this very moment in the opening decades of the 21st century. The very question, is there life elsewhere in the universe, is a question that naturally follows from the contemplation of our own existence and the desire to understand the meaning and the significance of our own lives and put our lives into perspective. It certainly is a question that has transfixed us for a very long time, going all the way back to the writings of the ancient Greeks, and it is a question whose answer has tremendous scientific implications. Why search for extraterrestrial life? Well, to begin with, there would be much to learn in being able to compare the biochemistry of any extraterrestrial organism with the biochemistry of a terrestrial organism, in the same way that we have learned very much about the processes involved in the origin and development and evolution of planets by studying the other planets orbiting our sun and, of course, studying exoplanets nowadays. And should we ever find extraterrestrial life that we could be confident was a second genesis, that is, independently arose from life on the Earth, then that would tell us immediately that life is commonplace throughout the universe, that life is not a bug, but a feature of the universe in which we live. Now, in order to search for something, anything, it helps to know what you're looking for and how to recognize it. And even today, however, we understand so little about life. We do know that it is the most complex, finely tuned, adaptive, high-fidelity, self-replicating, self-regulating process that we know of. We know that living systems on Earth are tremendously diverse, and they're found over extreme ranges of conditions, from the extremely cold to the very hot, over very wide ranges of pressure on the surface of the Earth, at the surface at the bottom of the ocean, and also deep within the earth, over very high ranges of acidity, and on it goes. And despite this diversity, we know that at the most fundamental level, at the level of the atoms and the molecules that are required to make organisms, we know that all organisms on the earth are biochemically identical. And so it is this basic biochemical identity that tells us, strongly suggests, that all of life on Earth had a common origin. Yet we don't have any consensus on what that origin looks like. How did non-biological systems evolve into living systems? In fact, I have to tell you that the speakers at this conference had a very heated argument about this on the bus taking us home from the rehearsal last night. And really, the basic problem is that we don't have a theory for how life originated. We don't have a successful explanation for how the various subsystems involved in life all got stitched together, how all the various attributes of life have come to be what they are, what the progression of events might have been that led to life, and so on. So we are left describing the general attributes of living systems that could be useful in searching elsewhere for life. That's the best that we can do right now. So what are those general attributes? I'm going to take you through them because it's very important to have a feel for what they are so that you'll understand why in the planetary exploration program we're doing what we do. So the first is architecture. We can describe the architecture of living systems. So we start out with the fact that there's just a limited number of chemical elements that go into all of life on Earth. Here is a portion of the periodic table. Perhaps you have seen this before. Out of 92 naturally occurring chemical elements, there's only a handful of them that are utilized by living systems. So the major ones, look at yellow, orange, and blue. Here's yellow. Here's oranges over here. There's a blue over there. Also, there's like a light pink. I think that's here. And so these ones are really the major ones for the non-bacterial world. That's it. So that's a remarkable fact. It's also remarkable that life is modular, that these elements go on to make molecules, and we only have a select number of molecules that go on and work as Legos. They can be put together in order to make more complicated and larger molecules. Proteins, for example, can be very, very big. They are a major architectural element of life. They make up more than 1/2 of the dry mass of animals. And they are because they can be very big, have all sorts of different shapes. They are multifunctional. They comprise the structure, the scaffolding that make our bodies, our hair, our nails, our cartilage and tendons and so on. All of that is made of proteins. And many proteins also serve as enzymes in that they aren't structural, but they actually can accelerate the chemical reactions that go on within an organism. Well, proteins are made out of amino acids. Amino acids can make eventually the structure of proteins, and also DNA. This is the genetic molecule, the information encoding molecule for life on Earth with its famous double helix structure, is also made as if by Legos. If you took DNA and you uncoiled it, it would look like a ladder, and two types of molecules make up the rails of the ladder, and 4 molecules make up the rungs of the ladder. And the success of DNA as an information encoder comes down to the fact that it has a periodic and a persistent structure. Its form does not change from one generation to another. And also, neither its form nor its physical or chemical properties change. The physical properties don't change if you rearrange the rungs, which is what what needs to happen in order to encode information. So this rather rigid, rather template structure of DNA is what makes replication and reproduction possible. And there are also other molecules like the fatty acids, which are essential for life, and carbohydrates, you've heard of those, we eat those. They give us energy, they're also part of DNA, they also form part of the cell walls. So those are the basic structural components of life. Of course, we have bones too, but those aren't organic, those are calcium. What's another attribute of life? And another one is called chirality. This is handedness. There are a lot of molecules that are symmetric, but there are molecules that aren't symmetric. They are like your hands. So you could imagine 5 atoms, or maybe 4 atoms, and another group of atoms over here. Well, this could be chemically the same thing, do exactly the same thing chemically, except here, this group of atoms is attached to this side of my hand, and here it's attached to that. Well, it turns out that life on Earth, for at least the amino acids and for the sugars, life has chosen one and not both. And it turns out the amino acids used in proteins are left-handed, and life doesn't make use of the right-handed amino acids. And it's the opposite with, excuse me, I have to remember what it was because I've lost my place, but sugars. Life uses right-handed sugars and not left-handed sugars. So this is just another element in the architecture of life. Of course, a major element is that life is made out of cells. Cells are the smallest unit of life that can replicate independently. The cell walls are made out of fats or lipids. And cells, if you think about it, are the means by which the organism separates out a bit of the environment that it can maintain, it can regulate, and therefore it can thrive by keeping the environment, like air conditioning. It air conditions its own house. And that is why it's been so successful. Others you've heard of, there's a human cell, and I don't know what kind of cell that is, but it's kind of ugly, isn't it? We're pretty complicated. So other attributes of life. Well, of course, there's reproduction. You know what that is. DNA is the genetic molecule, as I said, and it makes copies of itself when in order to reproduce the next generation, but it does another function. It's autocatalytic. It can make other molecules, which in turn make more DNA. So it's the engine of reproduction. And reproduction, of course, is not perfect. It, in fact, suffers occasionally mutations, which are kind of like mistakes in the transcription from one copy to the other. And this results in the organisms that have these mutations having slightly different, maybe sometimes way different, but having different characteristics than the parent organism. And the way this works out is that the vast, vast majority of these mutations lead to organisms that are cannot function, and they die before they're ever able to pass on their genes. But every now and again, you get a mutation that actually advantages the organism and makes it better for that organism to survive. That organism does go on to pass on its genes, and so that new mutation gets incorporated into the successful genome, and so the organism evolves, and also because of that, it can adapt. That's how it adapts. And then there's also metabolism. This is an organism exchanging materials with its environment in order to get the energy it needs. And it also involves the breakdown of materials, the conversion of products to energy, and the attendant construction and elimination of wastes. So earthly life employs a chemical metabolic process that goes on within the cell. And then my favorite, you'll hear me say this more than once in this talk, when organic chemists peer into the chemistry of the cell, such as one of our own cells, there are roughly, in our cells, 1 billion chemical reactions that go on every second, and all, of course, are required to proceed in order and in a timely fashion. It is a system that is exquisitely complex and ordered. You can almost not blame someone for looking at that and saying randomness could never have created this. Someone must have thought of this, right? The complexity of biochemistry is, in fact, right now a major area of research. In the last 40 years or so, there have been efforts to try to understand the evolution of living systems in terms of the universe's natural tendency to go from one level of complexity to a higher level and higher and higher. It's the kind of examination that, in fact, can be done on a computer. And this, to me, is a fascinating area where tremendous complexity can be obtained in an abstract way on a computer by beginning with extremely simple initial conditions following extremely simple rules. And over time, in such experiments, stunning complexity is observed. And in fact, efforts now are underway to devise a metric, a measure for the complexity of a chemical system in the hopes of identifying a biological system, not by trying to identify a particular molecule or looking for handedness or looking for the products of metabolism or any of the other attributes I mentioned, but just by measuring its complexity. The idea being that non-biological systems can only manage to get a certain level of complexity, but biological systems blow the doors off the house. They are enormously complex. So anyway, these are some of the main features of earthly life that we can sink our teeth into, so to speak, and have guided scientists involved in the exploration of other planets and who are interested in the search for life. And I'll say more about this at the end. In the planetary exploration program, the practical goal from the start has been first to determine the physical and chemical properties of all the accessible bodies in the solar system and single out those places that could house what has come to be called habitable zones, those locales that meet the basic requirements for supporting and maybe even initiating extraterrestrial life. And because we are a very long way from knowing how to identify alien life, that is life that's based on a completely different biochemistry than our own, when it comes to looking for life in the solar system, the most straightforward thing we can do is look for those environments on planetary bodies that resemble habitats on Earth and could support life as we know it, based on water, having all the attributes and chemical makeup that I just described to you. Of course, we only help ourselves if we bear in mind the possibility that we might confront alien type of life based on a completely alien biochemistry. But basically, we are focused on looking for life as we know it. So basically, the search for life in our solar system is the search for habitats, reasoning that what happened here on Earth could very likely have happened elsewhere. So where are we after 60 years of exploration in the solar system? Which locales are the ones that look promising? Well, you might have heard of the big four. There are others, but they're not so obvious and they're harder to maybe study. So these are the big four. They're Mars, of course. Titan and Enceladus are moons of Saturn that we've come to know quite well now that we've sent Cassini there, and it's spent 13 years there. And then there's the moon of Jupiter called Europa, which was studied by the Galileo, was first seen by Voyager when it passed in 1979, and then was studied by the Galileo spacecraft in the 1990s. So what are some of the environmental factors that have been considered up until now and have placed these these moons, these moons at the top, and what are the kind of environmental factors that will be considered in the future? Well, first and foremost, we asked, does the body have any liquids? Why a liquid? Well, liquids serve as a solvent. Okay, the solvent for our type of life is water. Water is a special kind of molecule. It's a polar molecule that can actually enhance, contribute to chemical reactions anywhere in the body, but it also just serves as a medium that allows materials to float by each other and actually join together and get something going. Okay, rather than having a molecule over here sitting on a rock, a molecule over here sitting on a rock, and they're waiting for the wind to blow. Okay, water helps biology. So a medium we think is very important for biology. That's what we go in search of first. Does it have organic materials? We're made out of organic materials. Organic materials have very special properties. We're not made out of iron. Iron isn't part of the chemical makeup that allows reproduction and so on. There's something very special about organic materials, so we look for those. What do we find? Are they simple? Are they complex? That's of interest to us. And then what are the available sources of energy? Sunlight, of course, serves for life at the surface of a planet, but we have found over time that we now have ecologies on the Earth. We found in the 1970s there's a vast ecology, many ecologies within the Earth, surviving without sunlight. And now we know that there are oceans on some of these bodies, like Titan, like Enceladus, like Europa, that also do not enjoy the benefits of sunlight. So in those cases, we'd be looking to see if there is available free chemical energy that could drive a living system within those oceans. Is there a habitable environment? And is it old enough for the origin of life? This is a very interesting criterion, because on Earth, at least at the surface, we think that life got started over the course of about 300 million years. That's the period of time between the end of what we call the heavy bombardment, when we think the surface environment of the Earth kind of settled down and it wasn't being upset by impacts, and then the appearance of the first fossils on Earth. That's a window of about 300 million years. So we take this seriously, at least when examining the surface of a body like Titan. You'll see why in a minute. If we're talking about, or Mars, if we're talking about, well, a comet could have landed on Mars and momentarily in geologic time, maybe it could be 1,000 years, maybe even it could be 1,000,000 years, that body of water, that small body of water lasted that long, maybe life got started there. Well, probably not if it didn't last long enough. So this idea of how the environmental or habitable zone longevity is an important criterion. And then would we expect life as we know it or not as we know it? I'll say that Titan is the one in this list where we might, at least we start out with a body that could give us life not as we know it. I'll say more about that. But the others are basically all based on water. And then, of course, when you're talking about building a spacecraft, putting instruments on it, sending it to a body that takes years to get to, you have to be very select in the instruments that you choose and the measurements that you make. You got to know what you're doing. And so there's a lot of practical considerations that have to be made. And the first and foremost is how easy is it to acquire samples and take measurements? There are oceans under the surface of several bodies in the solar system. It's not clear we know how to access them. They could have fish and lobster growing in them, but if we can't access them, they're not doing us any good. So that's why we concentrate on those for which the samples could be easily acquired. Okay, so now I'm just going to go through these targets to show you where we are. Okay, so here's Mars. Mars, I don't know, so I've often encountered members of the younger generations didn't realize that we had landed on Mars in 1976, but we had with the Viking spacecraft. And Viking had experiments on it to look for life. In fact, this is one of those big pushes that was made by Carl Sagan. In those days, everybody thought he was crazy, and almost everybody thought he was crazy, because he was going on talking about life like he was some kind of extraterrestrial himself. And it did have biological experiments. It didn't find anything, and we know pretty much now why, but it did find some important things. It found, what happened here? It found that there was frost on Mars, there was water frost, and also water had flowed on its surface as evidenced by the geology. You could just see so obviously the channels that were carved by water. And it was worked out that the water that formed channels like that probably dated back to 1 billion years ago. And this, I see why I'm getting confused here, yeah. That's what Mars might have looked like 1 billion years ago, might have had a lot of water on it. So that made it very interesting. That made Mars seem like it really could have life on it, or maybe had life on it in the past, and we might be able to find traces of it. There was hope that there might be some residual liquid water on the surface in some regions, and there would be living life, life that is present there now and thriving. But if not, maybe there were fossils. You could find layers of rock and find fossils embedded in them. Well, we know now that there's really no liquid water on the surface of Mars to talk about. And besides, over the course of several Mars missions that have examined the surface, we know now that there is a salt on Mars called perchlorate, and it's completely distributed over the surface of Mars. It's highly saline. It's so saline that if there were water there, life wouldn't be able to even live in that kind of a salty environment. What about organics? Does Mars have organics? Well, another strike against Mars' surface is that it doesn't really have much of an atmosphere. It's constantly bombarded with ultraviolet radiation from the sun, and so its surface is very toxic. So the only way you could be certain there were organics, native organics on Mars, is if there was a whole lot of them, because meteorites are falling on Mars and on all the bodies in the solar system, and meteorites carry organics. So you can't just say, I found an organic molecule and rush to the conclusion that Mars must have life because it has organics. So there are great challenges with Mars, and that's why I think the Mars community has largely gone in the direction of hoping that they could find fossils dating from a period of time when Mars was covered with water. Okay, so that's what we say about Mars now. We do have on the surface of Mars the Curiosity rover. There have been several rovers on Mars, but Curiosity is the one that's there now. And it went to a region called Gale Crater, this big crater. They had reasons to think that water was ponded on Gale Crater, and so they went there. And they have found spectroscopically that some areas of Gale Crater, and I think in this picture, I think it's this area right here. The beautiful pictures, by the way, from Curiosity rover. Kind of looks like Arizona. They think that this region is clay minerals, has clay minerals in it, and clays, of course, are formed in bodies of water. So that makes it very interesting, and I don't know where they will decide to go with the next mission, which is supposed to pick up rocks that a follow-on mission will actually bring back to Earth. That's yet to happen. But anyway, so it looks like it's going in search of life in the past that will happen on Mars. There is a possibility that life is there, present and living now, but not on the surface, in the subsurface, in the ubiquitous ice that seems to be in the polar regions and even the upper mid-latitude regions. There could be microbes living on the surface, the interface between ice and the dirt. So we'll see how that goes. The recently concluded Cassini mission was a very successful collaboration, by the way, between the US and Europe, studied two very special moons in depth. One of them is the moon Titan. It's Saturn's largest moon. And it's about the size of the US. It's completely enshrouded in a haze made of organic material. And after well over 100 close flybys of Titan with Cassini, we know that there are lots of light hydrocarbons on this, in the atmosphere. And we've done a great job of taking some beautiful pictures and mapping the surface of Titan. Here's another beautiful picture. And these are pictures taken with our cameras in two different spectral filters. This one allows us to see down to the surface, but we could never get really high enough resolution to see much. It was up to the radar instrument to really produce the high resolution images. But we had found Cassini-wide over all the instruments that the conditions on Titan were very dry in the equatorial and the mid-latitude regions. And that was very puzzling because predictions said there should be liquid hydrocarbons on the surface. Soon after getting into orbit came the European-built Huygens probe, and that finally landed on the surface and produced some fabulous images. You could see here two images taken from 16 kilometers altitude, 8 kilometers altitude, and you could clearly see a dendritic pattern. Liquid had flowed on the surface of Titan, so we knew this in January of 2005. We just didn't know, did the liquid flow in the past, or was it flowing now? And then it finally landed on the surface, and you could see it was very, very dry. I mean, no ponded hydrocarbons is what I mean by dry. And then we finally got to see that the liquid hydrocarbons, in fact, are there. They just have gone to the polar regions. We had discovered a lake-sized feature in the south, but when we got to see the north, that's when we really found the mother lode of hydrocarbons. This region right here, if you scaled Titan up to be the size of the Earth, would be the size of the Mediterranean. And the next picture is a radar image of this lake feature there. This is called Lake Lydia, and you could just see the coastline looking very much like a terrestrial feature. So while it is believed that Titan has a water ocean within it, that's not what makes Titan really interesting. It's the hydrocarbons on the surface. So it's not a moon where we would expect to find life as we know it, but it is certainly a good place to go to in the solar system to study abundant organic materials in their native environment. And it would be a site that might offer alternate chemistries, for example, methane as a matrix instead of water. But that kind of seems a stretch because the temperatures there are minus 180 degrees Celsius. So chemical reactions would probably proceed very slowly. NASA recently selected the Dragonfly mission. This is a drone that's going to go back to Titan, fly in its atmosphere, not going to go to its hydrocarbon seas, but it will examine the organic materials on the surface. So that should be a very exciting time. I'm not holding out that they're going to find life there, but nonetheless, we want to go back to Titan anyway. Okay, and then I see that I'm running out of time here, so I'm just going to mention Enceladus instead of getting to Europa 2. Enceladus was, that little guy there is Enceladus. Here's Enceladus compared to Titan. It's a moon of Saturn, about a tenth the size of Titan. Here it's compared to the UK. This is not meant to be a threat. Just want to make that clear. The zone capping the southern regions of Enceladus is crossed by these fractures, and we found eventually that those fractures have coming out of them, all told, about 100 geysers of vapor, water vapor, laced with simple organic compounds and tiny, tiny ice particles that we know are salty, and we know now they come from this whole material. All this material comes from a global ocean under the ice shell that has a salinity comparable to the Earth's, and they also have found evidence of hydrothermal activity. So what do we know from, and of course, if you take a picture like this and color code the gray levels, you can see that these geysers form a plume of material. And Cassini passed through this plume about a dozen times and sampled it, and that's how we know the composition of the material. So what we know from Cassini, I've said most of it, the vapor is mostly water, there's organic materials present. The icy particles that we see in the images were once liquid droplets that came from the ocean, and evidence of hydrothermal activity and so on. So, and this might be an example of what might exist on the seafloor of Enceladus. These are chimneys of minerals that get deposited out of the fluids, the very hot fluids that come from beneath the surface of the seafloor into the ocean, and they precipitate all this minerals. And on Earth, there are living organisms that live around here. They're thriving on the chemical energy that is abundant in these regions. So at this moment, we know more about the habitable zone on Enceladus than any other body because we've been there for 13 years, we sampled it, and we've proven that you can sample it. So I think out of all these bodies, it is the best example, the most promising place to go to test our ideas about searching for life and even maybe finding something out about the origin of life. And obviously, it's accessible because its habitable zone is expressing itself into space. So I'm unfortunately running out of time. I've got to wrap up. I don't have time to talk about Europa. But let me just say that once we've determined at a body like Enceladus, and let me just go back, have you look at this while I speak, such a pretty picture. Once we determine that a body has all the formal hallmarks of a habitable zone, what do we do then? Okay, what should we be thinking about measuring when we go back to a place like Enceladus with the proper instrumentation? Well, we could say we want to target particular molecules. We want to look at amino acids maybe, or proteins, or fatty acids. Maybe we want to look for DNA. We could look for particular arrangements of molecules, abundance patterns, like do we have more small amino acids compared to large amino acids, or do we have an even abundance of all of those? We could look for an excess of handedness to see if there was a large excess of one type of handed molecule over another. Maybe we could look for the products of metabolism. Each of these has a problem. First of all, they're so specific about assuming that Enceladus has life as we know it, that we could miss the big thing. We could miss the picture entirely if Enceladus doesn't have those particular molecules, or handedness doesn't even play into anything that got started on Enceladus, and so on. And also, these are these most simple chemical biosignatures. A lot of them aren't unique to life. They can be produced in non-biological systems in a laboratory under plausible simulations of an environment like Enceladus. So you could never really know for sure if you found some of these, if it was really a biological system you had found. I mean, even a large handedness signal can be produced, I've just recently been told, by a non-biological system. And we don't even have flight instruments to put on a spacecraft that could do something as sophisticated as detect and identify something as complicated as a protein. So a possible way out of this conundrum is to take many different measurements, in a sense, have them be orthogonal to one another, and if all the measurements all point in the same direction, then perhaps you might be confident you'd found life, but you still would be rejecting the non-biological result or conclusion on probabilistic grounds. I don't think any of that will give you 100% confidence. So to me, what would be the best would be to have a universal biosignature, one that would yield a positive result for any kind of life. For example, we could search for a generic genetic molecule, not DNA. But I described to you already the reason why DNA is so successful is because it has a particular form. And that particular form, actually, I'll just tell you one aspect of it. This is fascinating to me. The backbone, the rails of DNA, all those component molecules are all slightly negatively charged, which means they repel each other. Okay, now if they were really negatively charged, that would rip the molecule apart, but they're only slightly negatively charged. And what does that do? That makes it rigid. And so it doesn't go protein on you, if you know what I mean. It doesn't get all folded up and crimply. It stays a nice rigid structure. It makes it easy to replicate itself from generation to generation. We could search for a molecule, I should add, that tells you that in order for us in order for there to be a living system that has a high fidelity reproduction rate, that's probably the kind of molecule we should be in search of. So you don't have to know what the chemical elements or the chemical molecules are that comprise it. You just have to somehow figure out how to search for a molecule that has that form. And another universal signature would be a development of this complexity measure that I mentioned to you. There you wouldn't have to know anything at all about form or function or chemical composition if there really is a threshold of complexity below which non-biological systems live their lives, and above which life, that's where life is, because it's so complex, it's just so far above the threshold. If we could find a way to measure complexity, we would know like that we had a biological system. We wouldn't know anything about its biochemistry, but just to know that would be great, because then if you also had chemical instruments on board, you would know that you were measuring and identifying the chemistry of a living system. And of course, you could look for cells. Cells, it is believed, are also a universal signature. If you have a cell with structures in it, that is something that only life does. And so cells should be universal, since environmental regulation is a necessity of life. So I would say certainly what we would want to do if we went back to a place like Enceladus is take a microscope and look for cells, because it literally could be snowing microbes on Enceladus this very minute. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so we will start with our discussion. We'll then have time to open to the public and have a few questions. And so the two big questions in this field, and when we talk about life, are actually how did life originated here on Earth? And then the second, or followed by that, is there life somewhere else in our solar system? So you talked about that in your talk. I would like to continue, as you mentioned. Yesterday we were discussing on the bus about the origin of life.
That famous bus ride.
Yeah, the famous bus ride. And we focused a lot on deep sea vents yesterday. So one of the questions, and you also mentioned, is that obviously we don't know how life started here on Earth. It is the big question, and we're all trying to answer that question. And so, but there are different scientists trying to answer that from different approaches.
Yes.
One of them is obviously deep sea vents, and because we have deep sea vents here on Earth, and so we use that to study probably the origin of life here on Earth. The question is, or the point is, the deep sea vents we have now here on Earth are not equal to the conditions we had on the primitive Earth by the time life originated. So, looking parallel to that, there are scientists that also look into meteorites and comets, as you mentioned. And as we know, meteorites and comets are full of organic molecules, and some of them have been preserved almost since our solar system was formed. So the question here is, do you have a preference? Do you think not the origin of life, but the formation of those molecules that are fundamental to build the basic unit of life, the cell that you mentioned, Do you think that there was more input, or there is a more important contribution from meteorites, asteroids, etc., or more from deep sea vents, or why? Do you have a preference?
No, not at all. I'm agnostic on this whole thing. I mean, I think you have to be because, like I said, we know so little. You know, when I started into this and I got interested, I used to just study planetary rings. Saturn's rings were my baby. But once we found what we found on Enceladus, I just became fascinated with this whole idea. So over the last 10 years, I've more or less been a student of this whole topic. And what seemed apparent to me is that there's lots of people, because it's such a fascinating area, there's lots of people doing research. But there's people over here studying metabolism. There's people over here studying cells and what cells do. And then there's people over here studying how to build big molecules like DNA molecules. And they're all coming at it from a different point of view. So, you know, when you ask me, do I prefer deep sea vents or do I prefer materials coming in on meteorites? As far as I know, that's actually, those are in two different camps. So it's not either or. They're not really in opposition to one another, right? They're not. And when I say we don't have a theory of life, what I mean is no one yet has pieced together all these different requirements. I mean, like areas that we really need to understand. So I thought of an analogy for this. You can tell me as someone who studies this what you think. People nowadays trying to understand life would be like people pre-Newton, pre-Isaac Newton, trying to understand gravity, but they didn't know it was called gravity, right? Let's say they're interested in falling. They notice things fall, right? I pick up the glass, it falls. I take a feather, it falls, but it doesn't quite fall in the same way. It falls in a different way. And if I take a liquid, well, look what the liquid does. It completely comes apart, but it's falling. And then if they're really bright like Isaac Newton, they might look at the moon and they might say, oh, you know, well, maybe that's a form of falling. And they might be trying to figure out what's all this business about falling. You know, does it matter what shape the thing is or what color it is or whatever? And when we know now, it's gravity and the property that it operates on is mass. Okay, so it doesn't matter that it's as big as the moon or as small as a little feather, right? So I think that's where we're at. We don't have a theory for life. We don't really know what's pushing, what's shoving, what's or pushing and pulling, and what came first, like I said. So it's everybody coming at it from a different angle. So I'm hopeful, maybe because I want this to happen so bad, that in those places where people are studying on, you know, in these, like the Complexity Institute, I think that's what it's called in Santa Fe. The Santa Fe Institute is studying complexity. I know there's an outfit in Florida headed up by a guy named Steve Benner who's trying to make life. I mean, that's the other thing. People aren't really going to be convinced they've got a theory for life unless they can create it in the lab. But there's people trying to do that. And then there's someone in Scotland, Lee Cronin, who's the guy trying to come up with this complexity metric. So I'm hoping things really happen in those arenas, because that could be a really, you know, over the next 10 years, we might see some exciting things happen.
Yeah. In terms of alien life detection, I agree with you when you said we probably won't detect it, because, I mean, there are so many organic molecules and so many instruments that we would have to carry on a space mission in order to detect all those organic molecules and say, is it life? Is it just a contribution from a meteorite?
And no one's going to pay for that. Right?
Exactly. So you pointed there cells and other organic molecules. But do you think, and again, those cells are always based in carbon, and that the question we always get when we get public talks is it, imagine we have a different life form not based in carbon. Again, the question comes up because we only have a set of instruments, so we're limited by that and by the budget, obviously, from agencies and governments.
Well, we also don't, for alien life, we don't know what to look for.
Exactly.
We don't know the list of attributes.
No.
We don't know what to look for.
Exactly. But do you think, are you hopeful that we will find alien life and why? And is it going to be in our lifetime or not? And what do you think? What's your opinion on that?
Again, I'm not committing. I'm not going to say, because what I do want to say, and I hope I've impressed this upon the audience, is that this is a very, very hard problem. Mm-hmm. This is not like what we did in the early days of the space program, where we sent a spacecraft out into space to fly by some body, and mm-hmm. we were interested in finding out how big it is, how massive it is, what kind of geology it had on its surface, mm-hmm. how much light did it reflect, which is the same as saying how much energy is it absorbing. Those are all, and what orbit it was it in resonances with other bodies? Those were like the easy peasy questions, and we did them all already. Yeah. I mean, we've basically completed the reconnaissance of the solar system, right? Mm-hmm. When New Horizons went by Pluto, that meant that we not only covered all 8 planets, mm-hmm. we've been to comets, we've been to asteroids, we've now been to the Kuiper Belt. We've basically got it all covered. Mm-hmm. We've answered all the easy questions. Asking now, did life get started, is really hard.
It is.
So anyway, I just give us all a break, because it's really hard.
Okay, I would like to open to the audience. I'm just going to wait for the microphone. In the meantime, you mentioned the Dragonfly mission. I think it's going to be an amazing mission. This is just my personal opinion.
I think a lot of people think.
Yeah, and do you think life there is going to be completely different or not? Or it's going to be an extremophile that we're going to find or not?
I don't think we're going to find life there.
At all?
No, okay, and there I am putting myself out on a limb.
Okay.
Because A, I just think it's unlikely mm-hmm. for the temperature alone, it's unlikely, but 2, we don't know how to detect it unless someone comes up with a universal biosignature of the type I mentioned. I don't have hope for that one.
We have a few years to go, so fingers crossed.
Okay.
Okay, hands up. I would like to start by a lady, please. Okay. Okay, here. I'll go there to the gentleman in a second. How about here? Anyone? Okay, we'll go here. Okay. Oops, sorry.
Boa tarde. Eu vou colocar a minha pergunta em português. Espero que a doutora Zita Martins possa traduzir. Eu primeiro quero agradecer a fantástica partilha de conhecimento que estão a proporcionar a este público. A mim, particularmente, só posso agradecer por mim, não é? Mas houve uma questão que me ficou uma dúvida de toda a explicação, embora muito clara, que foi o seguinte. A verdade é que essa pesquisa pela vida, digamos, vida fora da Terra, é baseada muito no antropomorfismo, ou seja, quer dizer, estamos à procura da química do carbono. E se houver outro tipo de fisiologia, outro tipo de química que possa proporcionar outro tipo de vida, nós provavelmente não teremos meios de a detectar. Uhum. Isso não ficou totalmente esclarecido e era o que eu gostava que me dissesse.
Okay.
If you can remember all that, I'll be really impressed.
I'm gonna, well, it's a summary I'm gonna ask you. So basically he has to, it's what we were been discussing about the life forms, and it's all based on us, anthropocenic, obviously. And probably we don't have the means to detect any life forms that are not carbon-based. So the gentleman would like to ask you if you could talk a little bit about that and the technological difficulties on detecting life forms that are not carbon-based. Do you think we will have technology to do it? Not now, obviously, but in the future.
Oh, I think if, someone, we thought we found well, let me think about this. I don't think it's technology. That technology is not limiting us mm-hmm. here. It's understanding, it's fundamental understanding.
It's so the chemistry or not? Do you think we don't understand if the chemistry is going to be really different? Imagine it's not carbon-based. Okay.
Yeah, so let's just talk about, well, okay, so you could still carry a mass spectrometer, which is an instrument that is agnostic about composition. All it does is just mm-hmm. spread out in a spectrum, just like, the light spectrum shows you all the different colors. A mass spectrometer shows you all the different masses that the molecules or the atoms or whatever they are have in a chemical soup. So, you know, you could see, let's say you saw a lot of silicon. Silicon is a common proposal for substituting for carbon. So let's say you saw a lot of silicon, and so let's say you had no carbon. See, this is so ad hoc. Let's say you had no carbon but a lot of silicon, and then you had a complexity measure that was off the charts. Well, the complexity measure tells you you've got life there, and maybe silicon tells you, whoa, you know, that might be a molecule. I mean, you're really making me stretch here. Because
okay, let's try.
I mean, I'd have to think about it, but...
we all do.
We all do, yeah.
We all do. Okay, I'd like to take one more question from the audience. Let's see. Hands up, hands up. There. Okay. Okay. Has to be... Terá que ser uma pergunta rápida. Ok. Vou tirar. Obrigada.
I'm a geologist, and as geologist, I would like to help planetary scientists and exobiologists to find extraterrestrial life.
Yes.
All the exams you have cited of satellites have some kind of tectonics.
Some kind of...
Tectonics.
Plate tectonics.
And the Earth has plate tectonics.
Well,
Do you think it's a coincidence, or is something deeper significant?
No.
To use as a proxy for extraterrestrial
Okay,
life.
thank you.
So Titan probably had some kind of tectonics. And I'm thinking Mars, I don't know about Mars.
Not presently.
Europa, but I have Europa and Enceladus, but none of them has plate tectonics, and that's the big difference. The Earth is the only body that presently in the solar system has plate tectonics. And plate tectonics, let me remind you, is when you have a plate subducting under the other. So you get this recycling of material from the inside of the Earth to the out, back to the inside, and that kind of keeps the system going because you're tapping all the chemicals and material in the inside of the Earth. And that has been suggested as the reason why life has been so successful here. There's just a lot of chemical energy, in fact, available through that. So I don't think that's a factor. What the factor that is, that, as I said, but this is a selection effect. I put that list together because they have liquids somewhere. While Mars actually doesn't have liquids, we used to think it had liquids, or it had liquids in the past. Doesn't have any liquids right now, but all the others have liquids. So it was like the bottom, the most foundational requirement, does it have liquids? And then we asked the question, does it have organics? And then we asked the question, does it have, usable nitrogen, and so on.
Right. My hope is that we will find alien life in our lifetime. It will be really, really great, trying to answer at least one of the big questions of science. So fingers crossed. There are so many space missions going on from NASA, from the European Space Agency, from the Japanese Space Agency, from several space agencies throughout the world. There are lots of young people here in the audience, and I know some of them are future scientists. So we're counting on you to help us trying to answer this question. And just to wrap up, I would like to thank Fundação Francisco Manuel dos Santos for allowing us to have this beautiful discussion. And thank you so much, Carolyn, also for this fantastic talk and discussion.
Thank
and thank
you
you
for
so much,
inviting me.
all.
Thank you.